have Rebecca Sive, who I go way back with, Alice Palmer, former state senator the same, Dr. Sarah Malone, and historian Lori Osborne. And all of the footage met this historian's high standards in the program that we just saw. And I'm going to, just out of due respect, come to you, Alice Palmer, first. Tell us a brief bit about what you're up to now, and what did you see in the screening about the past that is relevant today? Alice?
Good to see all of you, and thank you, Sylvia, for including me in this. Always leading an eclectic life. The most recent venture is co-editing a book, The World is Watching, with my son and my husband, Buzz Palmer, which I think is very timely because it's a series of interviews and essays by notable international leaders. For example, just two of them, Shashi Tharoor, who's a member of the Indian Parliament and was at the United Nations, and Lord Meghnad Desai, who's in the British Parliament. And I mention this because the book asked them in essay or interview their thoughts about African Americans. And so this holds up a mirror for African Americans to see themselves through a very different prism. And I thought the film was fascinating. I'll get into that in a while. As with every American story, there are always contradictions. And one of the contradictions, of course, is about Black women. And when I get to those longer remarks, I want to approach it about Black women and fighting for the vote from a different perspective. And here we are, full circle. We have a Black American woman, a diasporan woman, a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, which marched in that parade. And time to get it on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator. I'll come now to Rebecca. Share a little bit about what you're up to these days. So much, podcaster, pundit. And what did you see about the past that's relevant in this moment?
Well, there's so much that's relevant. Thank you first, Sylvia, for having me. I guess I would say I'm continuing to do what I've always done, which is write and speak and organize and get out there. I do have a podcast called Vote for In, which is very timely at the moment. I think that the thing that struck me the most was just the power of the women, the commitment of the women, the willingness to fight back. And I think that, you know, in a time today when so many are feeling a bit, you know, not a bit, but some people are feeling a lockdown. I mean, even First Lady Obama, Michelle mentioned the other day about, you know, it's depressing. And so when you see something like this, it took too long, but the women prevailed. And I think the same thing is true this week as we look at Kamala Harris on the Democratic ticket, and everybody I know is jumping up and down for joy at that prospect and to work hard as we always have. So the film kind of gives us a context for all that, I believe.
Thank you. And I see there's lots going on in the chat. We'll come to you. We know that that in the 1860s, Black men, including Frederick Douglass, also left women out of their battle. And international struggles, Alice and I can talk about how they always said, freedom first, then the women. But join us now, Sisterhood is Powerful was a chant in this conversation. It is powerful. And one of those powerful women is Dr. Sarah Malone. Sarah, tell us a little bit about what you're up to. I know that you are working on a book. And then tell us what you saw that was relevant from today in the screening.
Yeah, Sylvia, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I'm really excited to contribute to it as well as to learn from the other panelists. I am writing a book and it is about domestic violence. It's something that I have a passion about. I am semi-retired. after working in industry for many years in consulting and teaching at Benedictine University. And now I'm really shifting my energy into working with survivors of domestic violence and the organizations that support them. So I've always had this interest and a desire to do so, and now I've got the time and I'm gonna put everything I've got into it. So in terms of the screening and what about the past that is relevant today, I think there's so much that's to that question. One of the takeaways for me was that we've come so far. We've got Kamala Harris as our nominee, vice presidential nominee, and that is just a major, major thing. I mean, that could not have been even thought of 5-10 years ago. But just as things have changed a lot of things haven't changed. White supremacy, male supremacy, and are still the core of this country's culture. And so no matter what we've done, we have not been able to eradicate that or change that. So what does that mean? Well, it means we have to do more of what we've been doing. It means we have to do it better. It means we have to do it smarter. But it also means that we have to be a little different. And this is something I've thought a lot about. I think about what's happening today in the Democratic Party and the things that and the accomplishments that we've made. And I have friends who are conservative who say to me, you know, all you Democrats do is whine. You just whine. And so I really think about that. And I think, and I shouldn't say rather, but in addition to being reactive, we have to step out ahead of the craziness. Right now, it just seems we watch TV, the pundits are on TV, they're talking about the crazy stuff Trump is doing. He is going to get crazier and crazier. And we've got to not only respond to his craziness, but get ahead of it so that we are setting the agenda, we are setting what people are talking about, we are taking the fight to Trump. And that's why I'm really excited about Kamala, because I think our girl is going to take the fight to Trump.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And there'll be lots of time for a lot more of your passionate thoughts. But let me just at least get our fourth panelist in, and then we're off to the races, all right? And that is a historian, Evanston leader. Lori, introduce yourself a bit and your response. Sarah's got us off to a good start, but tell us a little bit about what you see as relevant today.
So yes, my name is Lori Osborne. I'm the director of the Evanston Women's History Project and the Frances Willard House Museum. So it's all women's history all the time for me. And I've been spending a lot of time on suffrage and the story of Illinois, the important story, and really kind of missing story from this documentary, though it covers so much ground, it can't tell the whole story. And so I hope people will take a minute to explore a little deeper into the Illinois story. For me, what the big takeaway from this is that moment that we saw in this video of Wells being asked to
Ida B. Wells.
not being included, Ida B. Wells, not march with the rest of the delegation that she's traveled with. She's formed the Alpha Suffrage Club in January of 1913. The march is in March of 1913. And that moment and her sense of real anger and anguish over this compromise she's being asked to make, and the delegation is asked to make, and the willingness of some in the delegation, not all, there were members of that delegation who did not agree with this, but they did compromise and they did ask Wells to march at the end, and then she joins anyway. That moment and sort of thinking about compromise and when you need to, and the sort of expediency, the political expediency, there's going to be moments, as someone I think in the video says, you can't have the whole loaf. So when do you settle for part of the loaf? And when do you say, this is my line in the sand. I will not compromise. I will not. And Wells was such a strong, she had such a strong vision and such a strong sense of when you don't compromise. And the issues of racism, because it's really about life and death, that's a moment where no compromise should be allowed. And
we're in that time of history here, right?
Yeah.
Where questions of compromise, questions of big change. We're going to hear more from the Democratic convention this week. And you all thanked me, by the way. We thank WTTW for making this forum available. I did want to speak with all of you, though. So along with Tim Russell, I will accept that because you have so much to say. And I want to hear more. And Lori, I'm going to ask you just briefly because you were starting to touch on this.
Yeah.
So the anniversary is tomorrow. What advice would you give to a Kamala Harris? Would you give to women of any party about compromise, about this gender gap, which has widened? It started with Reagan. Under Trump, it's become like a, you know, the Grand Canyon. So what advice would you give around compromise or around anything else to take power for women?
Yeah, I think, and then maybe this is true for everybody, you have to know where your principles are and you have to know where your line in the sand is and really knowing and then holding that. These women, especially in this time period that the documentary covers, are really saying, we've been at this for almost 70 years. And we aren't going to do this anymore. We're going to bring the fight. This is when the tactics change, the whole approach changes. And Alice Paul really represents what people call the militant strategy for suffrage. So when do you, sort of, if you're a leader today, maybe thinking about that persistence, and then where those principles are and where you're not going to yield and what you're willing to give up. I mean, they're putting their bodies on the line.
And they are, and coming back, this is something that, Indigenous people, Black folks have understood a long time about that, putting your body on the line. Alice Palmer, tell us what you would say about compromise, about this moment, and about any advice based on history that you would give Kamala Harris or any other woman leader.
Well, I think there are three things, and Sylvia, you and I were in the anti-apartheid movement, in the civil rights movements, and so forth. Just three things that I think are important. First, know your history. Second, clarify and hone your demands. And finally, learn where the levers of power are that can help you win your demands. Right now, people in the streets and so forth, on the good tip, but it's got to sharpen because you don't get anywhere just out there. And I think the Democratic Party will make a mistake if they don't use this moment, given the uptick, mild words, of Black women and the passion for Kamala Harris. They will make a mistake if they don't turn this into some field work. I was watching a program yesterday. The Trumpites are going door to door. So we need to rev this up. And as I had said to the group when we were chatting earlier, data don't vote, people do. And Black folk want to have respect for their vote, no different today than it was back then. And so you've got to figure out a field campaign, even in the midst of this. It's important to show the respect and to ask for Black people's votes.
Thank you so much. Sarah, you were passionately sharing your thoughts and views. I want to shift to the question of barriers to voting. What does voter suppression look like today? There was a story that I heard that Lori may remember from the history of the suffragettes, that when one state was had ratified the vote, that they said, you know what, we've got to not let women vote because men might be dressing up as women and showing up and voting. So these tricks and plots to disenfranchise are not new. But what do you see what in terms of what voter suppression looks like today? And if the right to vote is the heart of democracy, you know, there's a lot there. I'll come to you and then to Rebecca next.
Yeah. So this is really an interesting question. I think that, well, when I think of voter suppression, I think about two things. One is institutional efforts to oppress the vote, as well as this micro oppression, micro way of addressing or impacting a person's right to vote. So institutionally, things that people are doing are pretty much the same playbook. It's just more of it. It's a different form. It's a different way of looking at it. Gerrymandering, limiting polling places, voter ID laws. They're getting more creative with these things, but they're using the same playbook. I think, well, I shouldn't say they're using the same playbook because now we have Trump. So now we have things like the post office and the craziness that he's doing with trying to minimize the post office ability to process mail and to process voting ballots. So all of those things are really done. I look at them from an institutional perspective, from a macro perspective. They dribble down and affect people on the ground, but people are thinking broadly in terms of how can they affect systems. So one of the other things that I think is going to be important for us to think about is not only how systems are being affected, but how micro types of voter suppression is happening. And I think about it specifically, again, as it relates to victims of domestic violence. We don't often think about this universe of citizens, this universe of voters, but these women and some men are often very negatively impacted by their abusers. I mean, think about it. Voting is an exertion of a right. Voting is an exertion of freedom. It's an exertion of agency. And what is more frustrating to an abuser than for someone he's abusing or she's abusing to really exert this freedom and exert this right? So I have to really think about what do we need to do to make it possible for women and for those and men who are being abused to vote and to vote safely. We know currently that 30% of women and 40% of African-American women are either currently victims of violence or will be. So this is a huge issue, and it's a huge opportunity for us to step in and do some things to really help some people out.
Thank you, Sarah. That really expands the tent there, and also people with disabilities and, you know, returning citizens and all kinds of folks have been compromised as well. So lots to consider. Rebecca, what do you see in terms of today's efforts at suppression? And I'm going to circle you back as well. I want to talk about that field work that Alice sees as so important. But first, let's talk about the suppression.
Yeah, I think as was pointed out earlier by Sarah, the playbook's pretty familiar. Trump has added to it with his outrageous, immoral, in my view, statements about people and making people scared to come out and vote and throwing sorting machines from the post office out in the backyard. I mean, there's no end here to the tactical moves he will employ to suppress the vote. He seems to dream up a new one every day. I think that the strategic point here is is that we've never seen this before, and it requires, as someone was saying a moment ago, a really new approach on the part of the
Sarah.
leadership of the party and the candidates. I mean, both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are optimistic people. That's clear from how they presented themselves and worked over the years. And I think they're just going to have to find a way somehow to communicate to the rest of us that here's how you can vote, notwithstanding these barriers. Here's how you, if you're able-bodied and smart and willing to knock on doors, as Alice pointed out, here's how you can help other people vote. So I think it may be difficult, but I remember those lines in Wisconsin. People were online for 8 hours to vote. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, I was in junior high during the civil rights era of the early 60s, and I remember we had conversations at the family dinner table about this. And, I asked my mother one day at dinner, well, why aren't you down in Mississippi? Because that was the, political ideology of my parents. My mom said, well, I have 5 kids and I'm going to do what I can here. And I think that's sort of the point, that there's really a need for all of us to look at the big picture, understand how horrible it may be, but on an individual level, figure out, here's what I can do in my community. Here's what I can do on my cell phone and in my neighborhood and so on, and writing postcards and, just all kinds of things. So there's no dearth of action we can take and inspiration we can communicate.
But that gets to one quick point that I want to interrogate for a second or two. You mentioned your cell phone. It's a new world. It's a digital world. It's a world when I worked for a campaign unrelated to any of my day jobs, but as Sylvia personally, and there was a generational disconnect between older people coming in wanting yard signs and younger people that like go online and dial up and download this. And so what's the hybrid? Because coming back to Alice, it's a sign of disrespect in some communities' views when you don't have that ground game and those signs. So what are you seeing from your role, speaking with candidates and women candidates around the country? And then I'll come back to Alice on that point.
Well, I think, what people are saying, I've heard this from a number of people, is people are answering their phones more. So that's a really interesting point, and I see Alice nodding. So that's significant. People who are going through call lists are getting a better response rate. Mm-hmm. And, since there is caller ID, you can sort of see, well, there is somebody from the Democratic Party calling me, and I understand that Kamala Harris is great, and I really want to talk to them. So that's happening. The other thing that also, the candidates are doing is the kind of thing we're doing right now, which is really engaging, at least face-to-face, albeit digitally, and really committing to that. I was on a recent program with Lauren Underwood, who's our congresswoman from the western suburbs in Chicago, and, so fantastic. And, she's calling lots of people herself.
That's old school. Thank you, Rebecca. And Alice, just to close that gap with you, what advice do you have for folks that say it's a digital game?
Well, just 2 quick things for 5
Alice may have
5 years. I was on the AAR from Chicago to Washington, D.C. In 2016, I kept sending the message up through the ranks, Hillary Clinton needs to hit the road in these places. I stopped in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, and so forth. And they were so busy doing polls and digital that she did not connect there. So lesson learned. Now in 2020, adapt. If it's a phone, then adapt. We used to do phone banking, do it on the cell phones. I'm going to send each of you, I just got from one of my students from Northwestern, all dear friends, Black House babies, I call them. And she sent a there's a young Black man who's doing a rap about Kamala Harris. And he says at the beginning, you know, all skin ain't kin. And then he said, so I Googled her. She dope. And it goes on to lay out.
Okay, we have Alice Palmer spitting some rhymes here. So Alice, share that, and maybe we'll also share it in the chat if we can. But I'm hearing you say adapt. I want to stick with you for one other quick point, and that is going back to history and the screening that we just saw. What lessons can we take away about the shortcomings from the suffragettes of the past? They were groundbreaking in what they were willing to do. They were up against not just men, but women who didn't believe that the right to vote belonged to women. But what were their shortcomings that we want to address, particularly around the lessons of race? And Alice, I'll give that to you, and then come to Lori as well.
Black women had to take a different path when it came to the vote. Remember, it wasn't too long out of slavery. And so the issues of American apartheid and trying to find humanity and all the rest of it, voting rights was just one tool in the toolbox to open some doors, smash some barriers, and fight against American apartheid. So the route that Black women took was to form clubs, women's clubs all over the United States. Margaret Washington, Booker T's wife, Lucretia Hope, Atlanta University, and so forth. Nanny Burroughs and Mary Church Terrell in Washington. My grandmother, Zella Ward, was a founder of the Indianapolis Colored Women's Improvement Club. And they were dealing with patients who couldn't be dealt with in hospitals because whites wouldn't take them. Now, if you follow that thread and go forward, you come and out of the organizations. Oh, and by the way, early in the 20th century, these organizations coalesced under the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And if you follow that through about Black women launching from organizations, you come to Ella Baker, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who was one of the formers of Freedom Summer. And then you get a young Diane Nash putting her life on the line to go to Mississippi to register Black people. You come to a Fannie Lou Hamer, who took the issue to the floor, the Democratic Convention, and an Alice Truguay, who was the queen of voter registration in Chicago and Illinois as well. So we must be mindful of history in this time. The incredible work that produced 1619. We have an opportunity, and we can face the history. We can figure out how to go forward together, but let's be mindful of the traps. And I'm looking forward to the going forward. And if any of you have not been to the Lynching Museum, you should go, because it wraps it all up in terms of what Black people went through in this country.
Well, thank you, Alice, that you are a treasure of history and knowledge. I couldn't remember half those names. I remember I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I know our Dr. Barbara Ransby, did such a book on Ella Baker. But this is why we need these generational conversations to know what we don't know and what we need to remember. And that brings me to our historian, to Lori Osborne. What do you think of that we should take away from some of the challenges around race with the suffragettes, and also any of the missing history that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think it's critical for us to really explore this deeply. But I am very pleased, especially with the approach of this series from American experience and the retelling of this story. About 3-4 years ago, when I started working on thinking about suffrage, the story was that Black women were excluded, and sort of that it wasn't because of that, it wasn't their history. And I did quite the opposite is the case. Yes, of course, Black women were excluded from the predominantly white organizations like NASA and the National Women's Party that Alice Paul founds. That's very true. But that does not stop anybody from working for these voting rights. And it certainly didn't stop Black women from organizing, from joining those clubs. I love that history that you related, Alice. Those clubs were very powerful, and so much work, especially in Illinois, is done through those clubs. Another important story is the Colored Women's Republican clubs in this time period. Lots of activism going on because, of course, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln in this time. So sort of a switch in parties happens after this time period. But so telling that whole story and the deep commitment that Black women are making to bringing voting rights to everyone in this time. It's a battle they are in and they're involved with, following the 15th Amendment and the end of slavery, and through this fight for the 19th Amendment, and then beyond that fight, far afterwards. So I very much am encouraged by this new telling of the story and including all those voices that we may not have known a lot about. There's been a lot of good recovery of history. One of the things I want to just highlight briefly that's not included in this documentary, because it isn't in telling the whole story, it can't do the whole story, is what happens after that March 1913 parade, when they come back to Illinois. What happens with Ida B. Wells and the aftermath of that parade?
What happened, Lori?
There's two big things that happen. One of them is that the treatment that the women got at the parade becomes the story. And they hint at this in the documentary. So people are shocked at the kind of treatment that women received. And it does make headlines. It makes headlines in Chicago. It makes headlines all over. And so there's a little bit of a wave that they're riding after that parade. They come back to Illinois, and Illinois women finish the fight that they have started. They've been working for 20 years, since 1893, to get the Illinois legislature to give them the right to vote on a select number of ballots. And by June of 1913, just 3 months after the March 1913 parade, Illinois women are voting on a limited number of things, but they're voting for president. By the next presidential election in 1916, Ida B. Wells and all the many Black women who live in Illinois and all the other women who live in Illinois are voting for president. So this moment of going from March and that restriction to June and the opening of the ballot, and then Wells, of course, sees this advantage and starts working to register, to get Black women in Chicago involved. This is a critical moment for that kind of power to be used, and she knows it. So,
and that carries right through to the kind of activists that Alice was speaking about, who continued that. Love the history, want to bring it into the moment a little bit, and to include Sarah and also Rebecca in terms of who has the mic now. What does a movement look like today? What's changed? Who's in the room? I know that Lori talked about how both in this conversation and in our preparation, how often it felt like it was a coastal issue and Illinois wasn't getting its due, which you can see her passion for sharing the Illinois story now. But we have some dynamic next generation leaders that are really stepping up. And some of these folks look like Black, queer, trans, you know, they look different. But who has the mic now? And Sarah, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, this is something that I really kind of thought about a lot in thinking about the film and some of the messages that were really intense for me. And I think, and we touched on this a little bit with regard to the tensions between races and genders and economic and social classes, young and old. These tensions are real, and all of these distinctions will be in the room. They are in the room. And the one thing that I think about in terms of what we really have to focus on is to make sure that these distinctions do not undermine the work. You know, we hold on to the things that are dear to us about who we think we are and what we think we are. And then we draw lines around ourselves and other people and leave people out and pull people in. And I think it's going to be really important, particularly now, that we band together as sisters and as allies, and that we lead with our strengths and not with our weaknesses. That we take a look at what we all bring to this, that we galvanize our strengths, galvanize our assets, build on them, magnify them, and bring the other stuff with us if we may, but let it not really undermine the work and the important things that we have to do moving forward for ourselves, for our children, our grandchildren. This is no time to get stuck on things that don't really matter.
Thank you, Sarah. And that might speak to some level of compromise for some. We'll see. We've got 2 virtual conventions coming up to see what plays out. Rebecca, how would you answer that in terms of who has the mic? Who's in the room today?
Well, first, just to add a little bit in that context, and Illinois has been, if not reported, it has been at the center of the modern women's movement since the 60s and the modern movement of women into political office and political power. I would say, as a Chicagoan of many decades, that we elected the first Black president. Say what you will about some of, history and politics and fights that were had back in the day, and I know Alice has a lot to say about that, but you can't underestimate the fact that this city has been a center of power for Black Americans. We elected the first Black woman U.S. Senator. Harris is only the second. And there are lots of women here who've gone on to other significant positions. So I guess as to who has the mic, at least right here at home, there's, as you pointed out earlier, Sylvia, an incredible diversity of people. I'm encouraged that people who had it back in the day are still speaking out, as Alice has here, for instance. But you're right, there are lots of younger people. I guess the thing I want to say, and this goes back to something just that was brought up at the beginning, I do think we have to be smart and prepared to, at the same time, speak vociferously, but also compromise when needed. My big effort, a book I wrote, published last year, was about electing a woman president this year. We're not going to do that, but we are, I hope, going to elect a first woman vice president, a woman of color. As Sarah said earlier, none of us could have imagined that. So I think that there are lots of voices and lots of opportunities for us to be powerful and speak out from whatever vantage point we have.
Well, I again thank WTTW for the opportunity to have this kind of community conversation. If you like this American Experience, the Vote series, it'll be on in September. There'll be more conversation about the Holocaust, I think on the 27th, more community conversation on the 31st as well. And we've got just a few more minutes here in our time together. I'm Sylvia Ewing, joined by Rebecca Sive. Sarah Malone, and not David Robinson, his mother, Senator Alice Palmer, and Lori Osborne. And we are delighted to have a conversation about the past, the present, and the future. I heard Mayor Lightfoot admit to, wouldn't know it these days, but admit to youthful fear. And I heard her be very encouraging in addressing a group of women, saying, be brave. What advice would you give your younger self if you were looking back? And what advice would you give to today's women, dads, to empower the next generation? What would you say? And I'll come to you, Sarah. I know you're a mom as well.
Yeah. I thought about this question and something almost immediately came to mind. It's not something that I would tell my younger self because my younger self heard this from my mom and her sister girlfriends. But they used to school us. And one of the things that I will never forget is them saying, baby, you got to find a way. And if there ain't no way, you got to make a way out of no way. And so that's what I would pass. That's what I would pass on to the youth and to people that are coming behind us. There may be a path that's scorched for us that we can follow, but a lot of times there won't be. And so it's up to us to make the path, walk the path, clean out the path, and make it possible for others to come behind us. So that's what I would pass on.
Thank you. That's actually beautiful. And I appreciate hearing that. It takes me back. Lori, what advice would you give?
Well, I sort of look and I can see what you're saying in these suffragists who are working long ago. When one way didn't work, they thought of another way. When they didn't have the talent or the idea, they banded together. We cannot do this work by ourselves. When we see something that we need to work on, we need to get together with others because the talents are there, but we each need each other to do it. You know, we can't come up with everything, but also that persistence, like just stay in the fight. If it's something that means something to you, you may be at it and you may not see the end of it. 70 years of fighting for suffrage, many women didn't see it happen in their lifetimes. So stay in the fight, be creative. If you're not the creative one, find someone who is, and do it together.
Thank you. Senator Palmer, what would you say to your younger self or someone else about being brave and encouraging them to get over fear? Talking to you, Alice, if you can hear me.
I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Yes. I would say 3 things. Number 1, to remember the mantra of the women who put together the Colored Women's Improvement Clubs, lift as we climb. Lift as we climb. And then I would just repeat what I said before with a tag on the end of it. Know your history, clarify the demands and sharpen them, and learn and understand where the levers of power are to help win the demands. And that the demands should be for system change. There is no excuse for the homelessness, for the lack of access to health care. And I won't go into the litany of those. We all know what they are. I agree with what Sarah and Rebecca and Lori. It's time for women to come together. If given the magnificence of that victory, there is no excuse for us not to have the next round of victories.
Thank you. And Rebecca?
You know, I was thinking about going back to your original question about what would I tell my younger self, and
That's right, please.
Yeah, and I flashed on a couple points I remember quite well that when my friends listening to this aren't even going to believe it, but when I acceded to the guys in the room, when I knew the most.
Mhm.
And I'm sure I see nodding heads among my pals on the panel here. And so, one of the terrific things that I've seen lately is, among the young women I know and work with, is they don't do that. And so I think what I would say is, to my younger self is, be confident in your own knowledge, your own ability to create change, your own power, as Alice put it, and to be assertive about what you believe in. And if people get in your face, just get in their face right back.
I love it. And there's a new generation that really lives it. But Alice, you said something earlier. You said that when you were working in some of these male dominated fields, would you repeat what you told people about what you would or wouldn't do?
I have often found myself the only woman, when I was running some organizations, the only woman in the room.
Right.
And so I made it a habit when I walked in the room to say, I don't do windows and I don't take notes. So if one of you gentlemen will pick up a pen, go have at it.
Well, I love it. We're coming to the finish line. It has been an amazing conversation about a really historic moment between the pandemic and all of the other pressing demands and fears that people face immediately in their life. We can't lose sight of this big picture and this thing called democracy, which impacts all of us. And having to explain to children things that are, unexplainable, that are happening in our name, is really something that gives every parent and every human pause. We also see great things happening, like we can get together over Zoom in a way that when people with disabilities were calling for things like this, we said it couldn't be done. So perhaps there's more that we can take from this moment. But how do we forget bravery or gender, but how do we keep democracy alive? Alice has told us about our history and knowing our demands and those kinds of things. I'm just going to ask, whoever feels really passionate about sharing your advice for keeping democracy alive to speak up now before we wrap up.
Can I just say, I'm the daughter of an immigrant who escaped fascism. I'm the daughter of a World War II veteran who was seriously wounded. My husband's father was Jew. We saw people die and spill blood for the right to vote. I mean, I just, we have to remember that. We have to act on that knowledge. And if we do, we will save democracy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that the fight, that watching what these women went through to get this right, and then also how the fight continued, and how they fought to protect their rights. And when the rights were being threatened, how they fought again to retain them. That we all have to be a little bit in this fight. Democracy is not, who said it? Democracy is not a spectator sport. I don't remember who said it, but it's not. Yeah, we all have to be in it.
Thank you. Sarah?
So Sylvia, yeah, so I had one word response to that really kind of sums up everything that we talked about, and that is vote. There isn't a greater opportunity to secure democracy, to protect our democracy. The vote is probably the one thing, the one thing that every citizen of this great nation can do: vote.
Wow, well, you can't put a finer point on it than that. We've had a very spirited conversation, and we've had the opportunity to hear from wise women. There's such a wealth of information on this Zoom screen in this virtual community made possible by WTTW, and one of many community conversations that help quality programming like the American Experience, the Vote, show that we just saw extends it and makes it personal and brings the experts and the people that we know here in Chicago and in our viewing area, that we bring them to the fore to talk about these big issues. I don't have a lot to add to the wisdom in the room, other than we're all on this blue planet, hurtling through space, and we have the privilege of being in this moment in time. It's a gift. That's why they call it the present. And what we do with it is critically important to each of us. The women that were named when Senator Alice Palmer went through that without notes history of activists and activism, they didn't depend on likes, and they weren't worried about, you know, who would unfriend them or say something mean to them in social media. And I'm not downplaying platforms that are critically important to a new generation. I'm just saying that make an impact in the few feet around you, the socially distant feet. Make decisions that you can live with, that you can be proud of when you talk to your children, and when you can say, like Rebecca, what your family has done and your lineage. Make those choices now. Remember to vote. Remember to support public television. Remember to be kind to each other. And on that note, I'm going to see if I have any other things that I'm supposed to do and say. I think I don't. I'm just going to thank all of you. And we so appreciate your time. Whenever people wonder, who are the talented folks in Chicago? They're all around you. Make space for them and pass the mic to them. That's it, everybody. Have a good evening. And don't forget to vote.
Thank you,
Thank
Sylvia.
you. Thank you, Sylvia. Bye.
Bye.
My pleasure.